Welcome to the CEC Report. It's March 30 and I'm Robert Barwick, and once again joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In today's CEC Report, first, now we know where Prince Harry got his dope from. Second, don't accept that the election choice is a bullet or poison. And third, unbalanced minds cannot balance the budget. So first, now we know where Prince Harry got his dope from. There's a massive scandal erupted in London this week. At least when I say massive, it's actually massive, but there's a massive effort by the press to suppress it as much as possible, which is this. Britain's regulator of its financial system, the Financial Services Authority, has whacked the Queen of England's personal bank, Coutts and Company, with an £8.75 million fine for breaching the rules that are there to guard against money laundering. Now, Coutts is known to everybody as the Queen's Bank, and not just because she decided to bank there. It's been the royal family's bank for centuries.
Well, the British Crown's bank, isn't it?
It's the British Crown's bank. It is older than the Bank of England. It was started in 1692 compared to the Bank of England 1694. There's even a Coutts ATM at Buckingham Palace, Craig.
It's folding stuff from there.
That's right. What Coutts was shown by the Financial Services Authority to have done once it was audited was it just ignored the rules that mean that banks have to, when they acquire clients, have to set up safeguards to make sure those clients, particularly sensitive clients in different countries that have a certain status, and politically connected individuals as well.
You also have to have at least £1 million, I believe.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be able to
big
join
client. Well, exactly. If you're going to be a customer at Coutts, you've got to have $1 million or pounds to start with, right? So it's already big people, and those people, of course, can be anybody, and you're supposed to have safeguards to make sure that you're not being used for money laundering, and Coutts ignored those rules. So they've been caught doing it. So officially, the charges against Coutts are not charges of money laundering. They are charges of not taking safeguards against money laundering.
It's absolutely astonishing, Robbie, that this isn't being reported on in the Australian media. I mean, nothing.
They haven't touched it at all.
Yeah.
And this is and compared, like the British media have had to report it because it's happened right there, right? Compared to the kind of thing, if it was a scandal about one of the royals' sex lives, Craig, the equivalent of a scandal like that, it would be reported here.
Yeah. Right?
The British press have reported it as the Queen's Bank, but it's not being touched here. Why? Well, there's an obvious why. We are why. This scandal blows up the single most oft-repeated slander against the CEC and LaRouche since we've existed in Australia, but which LaRouche has copped for even longer, which is that LaRouche says the Queen pushes drugs. And it blows that up because this is the book, Dope Incorporated, that LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review first published in 1978, which showed that the City of London financial system is entirely dependent on the revenue from the drug trade, and always has been. That was LaRouche's proof in that book, and that was turned to the slander that LaRouche says the Queen pushes drugs. And well, now the Queen's Bank has been caught out, involved in that area. There's another element here, Craig, I have to mention before I ask you a question. The Financial Services Authority announced this fine this week, just days after French presidential candidate Jacques Cheminade, who is your equivalent in France, he was on French TV, he caused an uproar when he said that part of the Queen's fortune comes from drug trafficking. And within days, her bank has been caught out involved in this activity. So just what I wanted to sort of put to you, doesn't this whole scandal though lift the lid on what is the true nature of British high finance?
Whenever this slander is thrown at us or LaRouche about the Queen of England pushes drugs, the point is that the British Crown has established itself, has always been involved in the drug trade. I mean, go back and look at how China was being attacked through the Opium Wars. This was the British East India Company, this was the British Crown that was using drugs as a means, as a weapon to destroy the Chinese population. Right now, nothing has changed in 200 years. And the purpose of this book was, chapter by chapter, to go through and actually illustrate for people how the money flows, particularly in Colombia, South America, at that particular time, were being pushed into the banking system, which banks did it, in order to prop up the international banking system.
Well, that part there, Dave, isn't that the real point now? That this drug trade is the only thing that's actually keeping the current British-dominated financial system going.
Well, that's the point. There was Viktor Ivanov, Russia's Federal Drug Control Services director, gave a speech in, I think it was Washington, DC last November, where he basically said that there was, up to $600 billion or thereabouts of up to $1 trillion of money, drug money, being laundered through the banking system today.
Because the drug trade is huge. It's the fastest growing trade in the world, and it has been for many decades now.
And his point was that in order to be able to safeguard the sovereignty of countries, right, from the drug trade and this money, then he said we needed to have a Glass-Steagall reorganisation of the banking system to get rid of this filthy money, to shut down the drug trade, full stop. But look, every country is affected by the drug trade. And even Australia, I think there was reports that we put out a few years back where we reported on the fact that the money in our own Australian banking system was something like $10 billion per year.
That's according to the Australian Federal Police.
Yeah, they were reliable sources, but you think about how that affects and impinges on the Australian economy, the black economy, and you realise just the extent of this, these drug money flows. And the point is that the Queen of England, her own bank, has been caught up in this. And this is not an accident. This is how a lot of institutions these days are funded, is through drug money flows, through the laundering of drug money.
It's without the liquidity provided by the drug trade.
And the other thing too, Robbie, see, people think this is not some isolated incident. Like, think about the world's biggest mega speculator, one of them, George Soros. This guy promotes drug legalisation all around the world. His Quantum Fund is one of the leading funds for the Queen herself personally. She's one of his 99 customers. So here you have mega speculation, the drug legalisation fraud, and the money laundering all coming together in the Queen herself. And this is not an accident. This is a characteristic of the British Crown. And it's not an accident that, you can put out a book of this size and detail precisely where these money flows come from.
Yep. And we're not quite sure yet, but if we have a better insight, we'll report it in the future. But it's really astounding that this has even surfaced in England, and that the FSA has issued this fine, because the British system has such little actual transparency. Normally these scandals get buried.
Well, it must be a faction fight. The hypothesis is some faction fight within the oligarchy, these ruling elites, where this has been even allowed to surface, Robbie, because it's really quite stunning that it could come up.
Right, well, Craig put out a press release on this yesterday, so you can read there for more details, and there's lots of links in that press release to back up all the different elements. So we'll leave it there. When we come back, very important post-mortem on the Queensland elections. Don't accept the election choice is bullet or poison. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Don't accept the election choice is bullet or poison. So, Craig, the Queensland elections last weekend were stunning, and it's been the most stunning election result turnaround in Australian history, actually. They show two things, though. One, that there is an intense mass strike rage in the population, else you wouldn't have got that result. But the other thing it showed is that the voters, despite that mass strike rage that's gripping them, are still conditioned to swing back and forth between the two major sides. All right? Voter anger is real and it's well-founded. Voters, what you're seeing in these results is what we've been harping on about for ages and ages, that there's a disconnect between what is publicly stated by the political leaders in Australia about our economy and what the Australian people are actually feeling. The Australian people are suffering, and that suffering is not being acknowledged. They're suffering from infrastructure that's crumbling, both hard and soft infrastructure. Underfunded schools, unreliable services, unreliable electricity supply, traffic jams that get worse in capital cities, no services in the bush, etc. This is what in our so-called wealthy country, this is what the people are suffering. The people are not protected from disasters that are happening all the time because they're told that it's just climate change, it's inevitable, right?
You mean levy banks like at St George and places
Levy,
like that?
exactly.
Yeah.
They're not protected, and when disasters happen, there is foot dragging on the rebuilding afterwards, right? Or people are thrown to the mercy of the free market with, say, the insurance companies
yes.
and those types of things. The people are copying green garbage. They're copying, in the case of Queensland, wildlife corridors, the wild rivers legislation. They're copying climate change policies, and meanwhile, what little infrastructure they do have is being sold off. This makes the people very, very angry. But here's the point to the Australian people. Do you think the Liberal National Party will change it? Swinging back to the Liberal National Party from Anna Bligh's ALP shows the tragic flaw that voters are conditioned to accept the terms in which the election is offered. And as a wise political observer said, the choice they're given and which they accept is choose your execution. Do you want poison or a bullet? So, Craig, my question to you, as someone who broke out of the two-party mould, which is why the CEC exists, you broke out of that more than 20 years ago. What would you say to the average Australian about this mentality?
Well, for those who aren't in Queensland in particular, but also for those who are in Queensland, because this show goes national, the point is that you're going to see the Liberal National Party execute exactly the same policies, because the policy direction is not governed by an individual party, it's governed top-down by the system, and we're under the influence of a global British monetarist system, private banking, free trade, globalisation, and so forth. There's no way an individual party that is as part of the establishment, like the Liberal National Party, which supports these policies, is going to change anything. So when you're looking at in 2-3 months' time, or maybe quicker, and the same policies get rolled out, there's only one person you can blame, and that's not the politicians. They're actually standing up there representing the fact that they were voted in by whom? The people. So people always like to blame the politicians for pushing the policies that they were elected to push. Or sometimes, they do turn around and vote for policies that they weren't necessarily elected to government for. But the point is,
but just before you go on, even on those things where they so-called lie, Anna Bligh lied about privatisation. What's the Liberal National Party policy on privatisation?
to push it.
Julia Gillard lied about the carbon tax. Tony Abbott wrote a book advocating that's carbon tax.
Yes. So you look at these people and you say, well, what's the system? What is the party that they represent? And you look at that and you say, well, these people don't represent my interests. But, the people go along, they vote. A lot of Australians don't think about the political system very deeply, and they just go and vote along personality politics, which is why the whole Queensland election was more run like a US presidential style election than actually having policy debates like there used to be 50, 60, 70 years ago, where the person wasn't necessarily just a lawyer or someone that came out of the local electorate office of the local MP. Ben Chifley was a train driver. John Curtin was a trade union organiser, yes, but he was also an editor. And you had a lot of people that were put into Parliament from ordinary walks of life, tradespeople, some professionals, doctors and so forth, but they weren't just from one sort of cookie-cutter mould, like people trained up in the professional political arena. So look, the issue for people is, for those who've got any guts and don't want to complain, actually use the soft option for complaining about their political leaders, is start to look for alternatives. We're here. We don't support globalisation. We've not deviated for that for 22 years. Our policy is great against some people because people themselves, they want to speculate. They want to make themselves rich in the stock market. They want to dabble in derivatives. Well, that's part of the poison. So they're already accepting the poison without even going to an election.
So there's a there's a flaw in the mentality, which we cop as the CEC, which is we always get a lot of advice, and I'm sure some of our current viewers would like to give us similar advice, which is that you guys need to do things to make yourselves more acceptable to the voters. Well, isn't the flaw in that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party very successfully make themselves acceptable to the voters? Therefore, isn't the problem what the voters find to be acceptable? Isn't that what's got to change?
Well, that's right, and that's the expectation of the voters has been groomed over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years under the rubrics of globalisation, of free trade, and the problem is you vote someone in, they do quite often the opposite, and you get the policies you don't want them to push. Well, look a bit deeper and look at the parties that actually don't support the popular will, because those particular parties, like ours, represent policies that have worked in the last 50 years. They're not popular now because you've had a massive media campaign pushing privatisation and globalisation for 50 years, and people are brainwashed in it.
Well, and that's the other element in this factor as well, which is the people can no longer tolerate the mass media, really. If they want change, they can't let the media arbitrate who's going to be the acceptable candidates to the public. And these are the flaws that are in the public's way of looking. You know, we use this, we've created our own media to get our message out, and for Australians who watch this broadcast, read the CEC publications, who get a sense of what we're saying and they understand that this is right to fight for, what you sort of use that as the motivation to get our material out as wide and as far as possible, which we put a lot of effort into doing, because we have to create that alternative to the media as well, or else they're just going to, they define the rules of the game.
Yeah, and there's a cultural element to this. Never talk about politics or religion in public.
That's right.
Never talk about that in family meetings, whereas in other cultures, it is the subject. It's a very vibrant subject. In Australia, don't talk about religional politics in particularly family meetings.
Yeah, which is the same as saying don't question things fundamentally.
Exactly, it's the same thing.
All right, let's leave it there, and when we come back finally, we'll discuss how unbalanced minds cannot balance the budget. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, unbalanced minds cannot balance the budget. So we've got the federal budget coming up in a very short amount of time.
Oh, there's another tissue of lies coming.
Another tissue of lies. Yeah, well, if you see the projections of the budget deficit for this year, how those projections have grown in 2 years from the 2010 budget, it's amazing. They've blown out from 10 billion to over 40 billion now. And the mastermind of that budget and those projections, Wayne Swan, is now foreshadowing some very serious budget cuts to achieve his pledge and the Gillard government's ironclad pledge that we're going to balance the budget. So, given that their forecasts are, don't hold water, given that they lie on almost everything else, you've got to bear in mind that their pledges are worthless. But this particular one is particularly nuts. Denial, Craig, is a psychological condition. It's a psychosis. And by that measure, Wayne Swan should be in the funny farm. How can you balance the budget in Australia if you deny that there is a crisis in the economy? I.e., if you deny that the economy is bankrupt. Let me just go through some elements. There is a serious decline in property prices, and especially in Queensland. Yeah. And it's shown up, it's hit the Bank of Queensland for a 6. Property price declines on the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast have been so bad that the Bank of Queensland has had the stuffing knocked out of it. It's gone desperately to the cap in hand to the markets to get extra liquidity. It's made something like a $50 million loss at a time when all the other banks are announcing enormous profits, right? Which are dodgy profits, but what the Bank of Queensland is a sign of, Craig, of what we've been warning about for a long time, that the decline of the property market in Australia is the end of the banking system, right? So that's one example. Manufacturing. Look at manufacturing. It's in its death throes in Australia. Now, the government last week announced they're going to support the car industry, which the principle of supporting the car industry is very good. 3 cheers. But what they're doing to support the car industry, giving it funding, is futile compared to scrapping free trade and putting on tariffs.
Well, that's the only way out of it, Robbie, because again, the entire Australia economy is governed by this whole policy of globalisation.
Now, Craig, they've made this decision because they're concerned about job losses, because they know the car industry and all the feeder industries are a big employer, but they understand jobs in numbers. They don't understand the quality of jobs.
Well, that's why it's really important to save the car industry, because these are high quality, high tech jobs. If you lose a car industry, you lose an enormous amount of technological development and high tech capability.
So for that reason, though, they've made this decision for the car industry, but the rest of manufacturing is about to go extinct. Let's go look at mining. Now, mining is the big one. Mining is where we're world champions. Oh, really? Mining in Australia is a net drain on our economy. You get mega profits in a concentrated sector that employs very few people, but it doesn't make up for the enormous damage that's being done to the rest of the economy here. And we've been saying this for a long time. We need to nationalise mining, and we need to have the only way to make take advantage of mining is processing in Australia. That's where you create wealth, is in the processing. Again, though, scrap free trade. So these are the three big areas of the Australian economy that are actually that are a dire crisis, right? And ignoring that reality, Wayne Swan is preparing to trash the last shreds of Labor, what Labor once stood for, by imposing austerity on the people in order to prop up the financial system with this so-called budget surplus. So, Craig, my question to you in the time we've got, why is balancing the budget such an important objective anyway? Isn't it actually a ridiculous one?
Well, a lot of people, Robbie, don't have much of an understanding about economics, so they compare a national economy to the kitchen budget. To the household budget, right? They're completely different. Governments have control of the money supply. They have the control of literally printing the money, creating the credit, and so forth. So therefore, you're not constrained by the idea of having to service the debt that you may have in a local family, right? Look, the debt is, we're in a debt-ridden global economy. It's a British monetarist system, which we've got written about a lot in the New Citizen. And therefore, if you stay within those sorts of parameters, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. Because you're effectively cutting everything in order to pay the system, to pay the bankers, to pay the debt. You've got to break from the entire system. As we've said before, you've got to impose a Glass-Steagall standard which separates the legitimate debt out of the physical economy from the speculative debt. And then you've got to create a national bank, which is, whenever we talk about this, people freak out. You can't trust the government with a government-owned bank. Well, we can't trust the private ones either, I'm afraid.
Across the City of London.
So the idea is with the national bank that you create the credit, not the debt, in order to build the physical economy, support your manufacturers, support through the development of large-scale infrastructure projects, right? And you have a policy to build the physical economy, not dismantle it, like you're forced to under a British monetarist system, a debt-ridden system. So the bottom line is people have to learn how the physical economy and budgeting of the nation is different than their own domestic budgeting.
Yeah, domestic households cannot grow an economy.
No.
The government and total national economy can grow all the time, but the government controls that if they control the credit.
And that's the problem, is the credit is not controlled in this country, it's controlled by the British financial system, London and Wall Street.
And Labor used to know that, especially Labor.
Labor fought against it.
All right, that's it for the CEC report. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.